Have you ever had to choose between paying rent or saving a child's life? This janitor faced that impossible choice at 2 a.m. in a hospital corridor. Contrary to what most people believe, the person with the biggest heart in this story wasn't the billionaire with unlimited resources. It was the woman earning minimum wage. I've researched hundreds of viral kindness stories, and this one broke the internet for a reason most people missed. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what true wealth looks like and why 50 million people couldn't stop sharing this video. Grace Washington's $200 sacrifice didn't just save a life. It started a movement that raised $300,000 and changed hospital policy forever. If you skip this story, you'll miss the moment that reminded the world what real heroism looks like. For Grace Washington, a 43-year-old single mother working as a night janitor at Children's Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles, that choice became devastatingly real on a cold Tuesday evening in March. If you've ever struggled to make ends meet, you'll understand the weight of this decision. Grace knew exactly how much money she had in her worn leather wallet, $200 in crumpled bills that represented her entire month's rent payment due in just 3 days. The Harrison family occupied the entire top floor of the hospital's VIP wing, a testament to the kind of wealth that could buy the best medical care money could offer. Michael Harrison, founder and CEO of Harrison Tech Solutions, was worth an estimated $2.3 billion. His company had revolutionized cloud computing, making him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley history. But all his money couldn't buy what his 7-year-old daughter Olivia needed most time. Olivia Harrison had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 8 months earlier. Despite having access to the world's leading oncologists' cutting-edge treatments and experimental therapies that cost more per day than most people earned in a year, her tiny body wasn't responding to conventional treatment. The little girl lay in her private room, surrounded by the most advanced medical equipment available. But the monitors showed the same grim reality that no amount of wealth could change her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Grace had been cleaning Olivia's room for the past 6 months, working the overnight shift, when the hospital grew quiet and families tried to steal a few hours of rest. She'd watched the Harrisons' journey from the shadows, her heart breaking a little more each night as she witnessed their desperation. Michael Harrison was the kind of man who was used to solving problems with money and influence. He'd hired the best doctors, flown in specialists from around the world, and funded research studies that might benefit his daughter. But late at night, when the conferences were over and the medical teams had given their reports, Grace would find him sitting beside Olivia's bed, holding her tiny hand and looking utterly powerless. Grace understood that particular kind of powerlessness in ways that Michael never would. 15 years earlier, she'd lost her own son, Marcus, to the same disease that was now threatening Olivia. Marcus had been 6 years old when leukemia claimed his life, and unlike the Harrisons, Grace hadn't had the luxury of experimental treatments or world-class medical teams. She'd worked 3 jobs trying to pay for Marcus's care, cleaning office buildings at night, stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day, and taking whatever odd jobs she could find on weekends. But even with insurance, the medical bills had been crushing. Marcus had died not because the treatment wasn't available, but because Grace couldn't afford the medication that might have saved him. That experience had led Grace to her current job at Children's Memorial. She couldn't save Marcus, but she could be present for other families walking the same heartbreaking path. Most parents barely noticed the woman who emptied their trash cans and mopped their floors, but Grace saw everything. The quiet tears, the desperate phone calls, the moments when hope flickered and died. Olivia was different from the other children Grace had cared for over the years. Despite her illness, the little girl had maintained a sweetness and curiosity that reminded Grace painfully of Marcus. Olivia would whisper thank you when Grace straightened her blankets, and sometimes she would be awake during the late-night cleaning rounds, eager for someone to talk to when sleep wouldn't come. "Miss Grace," Olivia would whisper, "will you tell me about the stars again?" Grace would pause in her cleaning to look out the window with Olivia pointing out constellations and making up stories about brave little girls who lived among the stars and watched over children who were sick. Those moments had become the highlight of Grace's difficult days, brief connections that reminded her why she'd chosen to work in pediatric oncology, despite the constant heartbreak. Her, Dr. Sarah Chen. Olivia's primary oncologist had been pushing for an experimental treatment protocol that showed promise for children with Olivia's specific genetic markers. The therapy was available through a clinical trial, but there was one catch: patients needed to cover the cost of a specialized medication that wasn't included in the study funding. The medication cost exactly $200 per dose, and Olivia needed to begin treatment immediately if she was going to have any chance of survival. For the Harrison family, $200 was pocket change, less than Michael spent on lunch at exclusive restaurants. But insurance bureaucracy and hospital billing departments moved slowly even for billionaires. The medication needed to be ordered from a specialty pharmacy, and due to regulatory requirements and paperwork delays, payment had to be made up front before the drug could be shipped overnight for Olivia's treatment. Michael had been on the phone all day trying to expedite the process through his wealth management team, but even his considerable influence couldn't cut through the red tape fast enough. Olivia's condition was deteriorating by the hour, and every moment of delay decreased her chances of responding to the experimental therapy. Grace overheard the frantic phone conversations as she worked, understanding far better than Michael realized that sometimes the simplest solutions were also the most immediate ones. Standing in the hallway outside Olivia's room at 2 a.m., listening to Michael's increasingly desperate calls to hospital administrators and pharmacy directors, Grace made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. She walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out her worn wallet. Inside were 10 $20 bills, her rent money earned through countless hours of night shifts and weekend work. Grace stared at the money for a long moment, thinking about her own cramped apartment and the eviction notice she would inevitably receive. Then she thought about Marcus, about Olivia, and about the simple fact that love sometimes required impossible choices. Grace had learned to move through the hospital like a ghost, noticed only when something needed cleaning or trash needed emptying. How many of us would even notice the janitor cleaning our room? But sometimes angels come in work uniforms, and Grace arrives in the most unexpected packages. Over the 6 months she'd been assigned to the VIP wing, Grace had developed an invisible bond with the Harrison family that they barely realized existed. She knew that Michael drank his coffee black and never touched the expensive catered meals that well-meaning friends sent to the hospital. She knew that Olivia's favorite color was purple and that she missed her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who wasn't allowed in the hospital. Most importantly, Grace knew the particular rhythm of grief that governed their days: the morning hope, when Olivia seemed stronger; the afternoon despair, when test results came back unchanged; and the late-night terror, when every beep of the medical equipment sounded like a countdown. Grace's own journey through childhood leukemia had been drastically different from what she witnessed in Olivia's room. When Marcus was sick, Grace had worked as a hotel housekeeper during the day and cleaned office buildings at night, cycling between her son's hospital room and whatever jobs would accommodate her impossible schedule. She remembered the crushing weight of medical bills that arrived daily, each one representing treatments that might save Marcus but would certainly bankrupt their small family. Grace had sold everything she owned: her car, her grandmother's jewelry, even Marcus's PlayStation that he'd gotten for his 6th birthday, trying to keep up with the costs of chemotherapy, blood transfusions, and medications with names she couldn't pronounce. The worst part hadn't been the financial stress or the physical exhaustion from working multiple jobs while spending every free moment at the hospital. The worst part had been the helplessness watching her son suffer while knowing that better treatments existed but were financially out of reach. Marcus had fought bravely for 18 months, enduring treatments that left him weak and nauseous, but never losing his gentle spirit or his concern for his mother's well-being. Even at 6 years old, he'd understood that they were struggling, and he'd tried to comfort Grace during her lowest moments. "Mama," he'd whispered during one of his last nights, "don't be sad about the money. When I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jesus to send you lots of dollars so you don't have to work so much." Grace had lost Marcus on a Thursday morning in December, holding his small hand as he slipped away peacefully in his sleep. The medical bills had continued arriving for months afterward, a cruel reminder of a fight they'd ultimately lost, despite Grace's desperate efforts to provide every possible treatment. After Marcus's death, Grace had spiraled into a depression so deep that she'd barely functioned for 2 years. She'd lost her apartment, moved in with her sister, and struggled to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to punish people for loving too much and having too little. Working at Children's Memorial had been part of her healing process, a way to honor Marcus's memory, while being present for other families facing the same journey. Grace had chosen the night shift specifically because it allowed her to witness the most vulnerable moments when parents dropped their brave facades and allowed themselves to grieve in the darkness. She'd cleaned the rooms of dozens of sick children over the years, each one carrying an echo of Marcus that both comforted and wounded her. Some families barely acknowledged her presence, too consumed by their own crisis to notice the woman emptying their trash. Others were polite, but distant, treating her with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for service workers. But the Harrisons were different. Despite their wealth and status, they possessed a fundamental humanity that Grace found both surprising and deeply moving. Michael always looked up when Grace entered the room, offering a tired smile and a genuine thank you for her work. Sometimes he would ask about her shift, showing the kind of interest in her well-being that Grace rarely experienced from the families she served. Olivia was even more remarkable. The little girl seemed to understand instinctively that Grace was more than just a cleaning lady. She was someone who genuinely cared about her recovery and happiness. "Miss Grace," Olivia would whisper during those late-night conversations, "do you think the stars can see inside hospitals?" "Oh yes, baby girl," Grace would respond, pausing in her work to sit beside Olivia's bed. "The stars see everything, and they're especially good at watching over brave little girls who are fighting big battles." These moments had become sacred to Grace, brief connections that reminded her why she'd chosen to work in pediatric oncology despite the constant exposure to heartbreak. In Olivia's curiosity and resilience, Grace saw echoes of Marcus that brought both pain and comfort. Comment below if you've ever met someone who worked behind the scenes but had the biggest heart. There's something special about people who choose to serve others without seeking recognition, isn't there? Grace had also developed a deep respect for Michael Harrison that had nothing to do with his wealth or business success. She'd watched him cancel board meetings to read to Olivia, seen him sleep in an uncomfortable hospital chair for weeks rather than leave his daughter's side, and witnessed him cry quietly in the hallway when he thought no one was looking. Unlike many wealthy parents, she'd observed Michael never tried to use his money as a shield against the reality of his daughter's illness. He understood that leukemia didn't care about bank accounts or business achievements, and he approached Olivia's treatment with the humility of any parent facing their worst nightmare. The irony wasn't lost on Grace that she, a woman who cleaned floors for minimum wage, was about to make a financial sacrifice for a family worth billions. But having walked this path herself, she understood something that Michael's wealth had shielded him from experiencing. Sometimes love required choices that made no practical sense, decisions that prioritized another person's well-being over your own survival. As Grace stood outside Olivia's room at 2 a.m., listening to Michael's increasingly frantic phone calls about medication delays and insurance authorizations, she realized that all his money couldn't solve the immediate problem of bureaucratic delays. But her $200 could. The choice should have been impossible. Rent money versus medicine for someone else's child. Financial security versus an act of pure compassion. But for Grace, who had learned that love was the only currency that truly mattered, the decision was surprisingly clear. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity. At 2:17 a.m. on that Tuesday night, Grace Washington walked into Olivia Harrison's hospital room carrying $200 in crumpled bills and a heart full of the kind of courage that can only come from understanding loss. Michael was slumped in the chair beside Olivia's bed, his expensive suit wrinkled from days of wearing the same clothes, his phone pressed against his ear as he pleaded with yet another administrator about expediting the medication order. "I understand the protocol," he was saying, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and frustration. But my daughter doesn't have time for protocol. She needs this medication now tonight, or she might not have it tomorrow. Grace knocked softly on the doorframe, her usual practice to avoid startling families during her cleaning rounds. Michael looked up, and she could see the desperation in his eyes, the look of a man who had built an empire through determination and strategic thinking, but found himself powerless against the bureaucracy of modern medicine. "Mr. Harrison," Grace said quietly, stepping into the room with her cleaning supplies. "I couldn't help but overhear your phone calls." Michael ended his call and rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm sorry if we've been keeping you from your work, Grace. I know you have other rooms to clean." "That's not why I'm here," Grace replied, setting down her mop bucket and reaching into her uniform pocket. "I heard that Olivia needs $200 for her medicine." Michael nodded, too exhausted to question why his daughter's janitor was interested in their medical situation. "The insurance will eventually cover it, and obviously the money isn't an issue, but the pharmacy requires payment up front before they'll ship overnight. My accountant can't cut a check until tomorrow morning, and the wire transfer systems are down until business hours." Grace pulled the worn bills from her pocket, 10 20s that represented every dollar she had in the world. "I have $200, she said, simply holding out the money toward Michael. The transformation on Michael's face was immediate and profound. He stared at the crumpled bills in Grace's outstretched hand, then at her face, trying to process what she was offering. "Grace, I can't. This is your money. This is probably your rent, your groceries, your—" "This is my choice," Grace interrupted gently. "Olivia needs this medicine tonight. I have $200 tonight. Sometimes the solution is just that simple. I don't know about you, but this is the kind of person I aspire to be. Michael Harrison, a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals and commanded respect in boardrooms around the world, found himself speechless in the face of such pure generosity." "But Grace," he whispered, his voice breaking, "if I take this money, how will you pay your rent? How will you buy food? I can't let you sacrifice your basic needs for my daughter." Grace smiled with the kind of peace that comes from making a decision aligned with your deepest values. "Mr. Harrison, 15 years ago, I had a son named Marcus who died from the same disease that Olivia has. I couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved him. I've been working in this hospital ever since, and I've watched dozens of families go through what you're going through right now." Tears began flowing down Michael's face as Grace continued. "If I can help one little girl get the medicine she needs when she needs it, then everything I've been through with Marcus means something. This isn't charity, Mr. Harrison. This is love in action." Michael looked at Olivia sleeping peacefully, despite the tubes and wires surrounding her small body. When he turned back to Grace, his voice was barely a whisper. "How do I ever repay something like this?" "You don't repay it," Grace said, pressing the money into his hands. "You just make sure Olivia gets her medicine, and someday when you see someone else who needs help, you remember this moment." Michael stared at the bills in his hands, money that smelled like Grace's perfume and bore the creases of a working woman's wallet. In that moment, he understood something that all his business success had never taught him. True wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the willingness to sacrifice for others. With shaking hands, Michael pulled out his phone and called the pharmacy's 24-hour line. "This is Michael Harrison. I have the $200 for my daughter's medication. I can pay over the phone right now." As he provided Grace's money as payment for Olivia's life-saving medicine, Michael felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of the world. A woman who earned in a month what he spent on lunch had just given everything she had to save his daughter's life. Wait until you hear how the internet responded. You're going to get chills. 3 hours later, when the medication arrived and Olivia received her first dose of the experimental treatment, Michael made a decision that would change Grace's life forever. He pulled out his phone and began recording a video that would eventually be viewed by over 50 million people worldwide. "I want to tell you about the most extraordinary person I've ever met," he began, his voice still thick with emotion. "Her name is Grace Washington, and tonight she gave her last $200 to save my daughter's life." The video that Michael posted to his social media accounts at 6 a.m. went viral within hours. By noon, it had been shared over 1 million times. By the end of the week, Grace Washington had become the most famous janitor in America, and her story had sparked a global conversation about kindness, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. This is why I share these stories, because heroes walk among us every day, and sometimes they wear janitor uniforms and carry mop buckets. Michael's video led to an outpouring of support that restored people's faith in humanity. Within 24 hours, a GoFundMe account established by viewers had raised over $300,000 for Grace. Major news networks picked up the story, celebrities shared it on their platforms, and people from around the world sent letters expressing how Grace's sacrifice had inspired them to be more generous. But the most important outcome was Olivia's recovery. The experimental treatment worked, and within 6 months, her leukemia was in complete remission. Grace was present for every milestone: the first clear blood test, the day Olivia's hair started growing back, and the moment she was declared cancer-free. Michael didn't just repay Grace's $200. He offered her a position as Director of Family Support Services at the new children's wing he funded at the hospital. Grace accepted, using her experience and compassion to help other families navigate the challenges of childhood illness. The Grace Washington Foundation, established with part of the viral fundraising money, now provides emergency financial assistance to families facing medical crises, ensuring that no parent has to choose between rent money and their child's medicine. If Grace's story moved you, like it moved millions of people around the world, you're going to love what's coming next. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because next week I'm sharing the story of a grocery store cashier who spent her life savings to buy a wheelchair for a billionaire's disabled son when insurance wouldn't cover it. And the week after, you'll meet the school bus driver whose $50 act of kindness changed a tech mogul's entire perspective on success. These stories prove that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in the size of your heart and your willingness to help others. Grace Washington reminded us all what true generosity looks like, and her story sparked a movement of kindness that's still rippling across the internet today. Which act of kindness has inspired you most recently? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear about the good in this world. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that humanity is still beautiful, share this video with them. Grace Washington proved something the world desperately needed to remember. True wealth isn't about what you have in your bank account, it's about what you're willing to give from your heart. In a world obsessed with accumulating more, she showed us that the greatest riches come from lifting others up, even when you have almost nothing yourself. If stories like Grace's remind you why humanity is worth believing in, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because when we share these moments of pure love in action, we create ripples of kindness that can change the world one heart at a time.